Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn program. Lashana Tova, Happy New Year to those of you who are celebrating. Yesterday, we marked the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack and massacre of Israelis. In this past year, Holocaust education and the role of our Holocaust Center have been faced with new challenges and new expectations. There are holes in the education system that need to be filled, and we appear best poised to address the difficult conversations, the polarized opinions, the threats, the hate speech, the anti-Semitism, and also the opportunities to find common ground. We are leaning into these hard topics and also staying true to our mission to teach through the stories and lessons of the Holocaust, to inspire change, to inspire hard conversations, to inspire people to see others as individual and complex human beings. I want to share two examples that exemplify how we are doing this. The first is our Student Leadership Board. In September, 45 students from around the state of Washington were selected to be part of our Student Leadership Board. This board started in Seattle and now has two satellite locations, one in Kalama, which is in Southwest Washington, and one in Spokane. These students have committed to meeting twice a month to learn about the Holocaust and use these lessons to make a difference in their own schools and communities. They are ready and willing to tackle the tough topics. One student wrote, "There has been an uptick in anti-Semitism and misinformation regarding the Holocaust. I want to be part of the effort to curb that. Being on the Student Leadership Board provides an avenue for me to achieve this." While middle school and high school students are central to Holocaust education, we recognize that the Holocaust has lessons and stories that are critical to many different sectors of the population. Our Law Enforcement and Society program is designed to connect police officers to their core values to protect the public. It teaches them about what can happen and what did happen in a society where police treated people differently because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or beliefs. Since we began offering the program in 2017, we have trained over 3,100 police officers from across the state, including police departments in Seattle, Kent, Arlington, Snohomish, Linwood, the Lummi Tribal Police, the Tulalip Tribal Police, the state troopers, and many others. At one of these trainings was Detective Elizabeth Wareing with the Seattle Police Department. Detective Wareing has worked as a police officer since 1997. Currently, she is responsible for coordinating and conducting hate crime investigations, analyzing bias crime data, responding to media requests, and conducting public outreach and training on hate crime response. She was a member of the Washington State Attorney General's Hate Crime Advisory Working Group and continues to advise on matters related to legislation and training for Washington State. She is a voting member of the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Hate Crime Statistics Task Force, and she was awarded the Seattle Police Department's Excellence Award in 2017 for hostage negotiation, and in 2021 for her work as bias crimes coordinator. In addition to her work in the Seattle Police Department, Detective Wareing is currently a doctoral student in the Leadership and Change program at Antioch University. Detective Wareing, it is such an honor to have you with us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be part of this program. And for those of you watching, we'll have time for questions at the end of the program. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A at any time during the program. Detective Wareing, can you start us out by telling us a little bit about your role and also define for us what is considered a hate crime versus a bias crime?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say I'm incredibly honored to be here talking with you. I think so much of the work of the Holocaust Center. And yes, I was at one of those trainings myself years ago and just found it incredibly valuable and so important in broadening the context that police officers have for their work. So thank you for what you do. So I'll just start by talking a little bit about My role as the bias crime coordinator. And just kind of at the outset, the words bias and hate tend to be kind of interchangeable in this context. So, but I can talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So I was the first to have this full-time role as the bias crime coordinator at the Seattle Police Department. When I took it in 2015, historically, it had been handled as kind of an extra by another detective who was also handling felony level um, elder abuse cases. And those are two highly just kind of very incompatible uh, roles for one detective to have. It was clear to the department that there was plenty of bias crime, uh, plenty of tasks to be done full time by a detective. So I was the first to take that role. The primary job of the bias crime coordinator is criminal investigations, handling hate crime investigation, as well as consulting on investigations being done by other investigators in the department. For example, if we had a hate motivated homicide, I work out of the homicide and assault unit. I would consult with detectives working on that homicide if we thought it was a hate-based crime or had an aspect of that potentially. That could be, additionally, an SAU case, a special assault unit case, um, or a robbery, for example. So those are other units that I consult with frequently on different cases. Um, Additionally, statistical data keeping, you mentioned that. That is a big part of this job, is ensuring that we actually capture every single reported instance of hate and bias in the city. Anything that's reported to an officer should be documented. We believe that. We publish those numbers on our bias crime dashboard. If you wanted to look at that dashboard yourself, anyone who's watching today, just Seattle Police Bias Crime Dashboard will pull that up, and you can sort the data many, many different ways by neighborhood and type and timelines, etc. Um, we have gone even further than just relying on officers clicking the correct boxes. We also have an AI tool that goes through every report looking for indicators of bias or hate in reports to ensure that we catch absolutely everything. Any words that are typically indicative of a hate-related crime, we'll review that report as well, or string of words or circumstance. So that's something we've been doing for about the last year to ensure that we're capturing all of the reports that are made. Um,
So can I ask you,
just,
I have a question just about the
yeah.
reporting. So we frequently work with organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, which I know is also gathering data on some of these incidents. Do you share information? Like or are you each collecting information separately? How does that intersect?
So I can't really speak to how ADL collects their data. There are a lot of agencies or organizations that collect data. Um, you know, the way we gather ours exclusively document what is reported to the police department.
Mhm.
So their data set, if they have a way that you can report online or a way that you can report on by phone to a hotline, obviously that's going to be capturing something different. There may be dual reporting where people will make a police report and then also report to ADL. Um, there may be people who are more comfortable reporting to an organization other than law enforcement. When I first started this position, there was kind of a landslide of different like media organizations wanting to be a repository for reporting. King County has a group that captures data, but they don't capture what we capture. So there's really no way to kind of make them straight across. I think data gathered by other organizations is really interesting, and I look at it certainly, um, but also recognizing that our criteria might be different. There may be double reporting. But one of the things that I would say about our numbers in law enforcement, and really anybody's numbers, whether we're talking about formal reporting to the police or we're talking about reporting to ADL or Southern Poverty Law or the King County Hotline, what we know about hate crime is really the tip of the iceberg. I think, I can say at Seattle, I think we know a lot about what the tip of our iceberg looks like than most agencies in the country. And I'm proud of that, but also recognizing that we don't get every report. People are not going to report everything. And one of the challenges, that we face in our city right now is a staffing crisis. It's hard to make a police report here right now for on some occasions where someone may call 911 and it may take 24 hours for an officer to respond, or you're sent to our online our phone reporting queue, and you may be on hold for an hour and give up. So there are a lot of variables that can play into whether or not we get those reports. And that is an unfortunate reality in this city right now. So I keep that in mind as well. I think, I never get too high and mighty about our reporting because I understand those limitations. And then, sometimes I'm really surprised. I thought, in 2020, people were staying home, they were interacting less on the streets, ostensibly, right? But 2020 was an incredible year for hate crime numbers. It just shot up in 2020. So, uh, really, what I focus on when it comes to data reporting is ensuring that ours is really solid as much as I can make it be. And then also really trying to inspire other agencies to do similar reporting to what we capture. We capture a pretty broad swath of reports. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the type of reporting that we do and how we categorize things. Um, but the FBI CJIS work is really aimed at getting those underreporting states and municipalities within those states and counties within those states, um, reporting properly and educating their officers on recognizing hate incidents. Really standardizing it across the country. And one of my dreams, in my time in this role is coming to a close. Really, is to standardize it across the state of Washington, and I think we're gonna get there in the next couple of years. So, and then the other thing that I do is public outreach and instruction. So public outreach to groups that ask me to speak, going out, when we have a major incident or an incident that's really impacted a community, and being available to answer questions and talk about safety and talk about specific cases and answer questions about why it was handled a certain way, for example. And with that also is an education piece for law enforcement. I am responsible for making sure that SPD conducts training regularly and that the training is informative, and that it really speaks to what we need to be doing as a department to ensure that we're capturing the data and handling these things appropriately. Most importantly is that we handle them well. So ensuring that, but I also teach at the Criminal Justice Training Center every single class. I'll be instructing that across the state. I guess I'm instructing that across the state now. I've introduced a new, kind of redone my curriculum, and typically I've gone to the Burien Academy where we've taught half the state, but that has broadened out to the east side of the state now as well. So that'll be standardized as well.
That's great.
I think I've covered most of what I do.
That's great. You're doing incredible work. I wonder, maybe just to help people all get on the same page, can you define for us what a hate crime is, and maybe
Absolutely.
how some of those different categories that you mentioned and how you differentiate between them?
For sure. Why don't we start by talking about what the RCW says, the Revised Code of Washington about hate crime. So the next slide, and I'm just going to read it off the slide and we can talk about the specifics of it. let's see, a person is guilty of a hate crime offense if he or she maliciously and intentionally commits one of the following acts because of his or her perception of the victim's race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, gender expression or identity, or mental, physical, or sensory disability. So that is, those are the categories covered at the felony level. So that's in the Revised Code of Washington. That's our hate crime law, our felony hate crime law. In the city of Seattle, which is unique, there is at the gross misdemeanor level what's called malicious harassment. And malicious harassment is what the RCW was formerly called before it was retitled hate crime offense. So the malicious harassment municipal code, those cases are non-felonies that are prosecuted by the city attorney's office. They add the categories of homelessness, political ideology, age, parental status, and marital status. I will tell you that the categories of anti-homelessness and anti-political ideology are the categories that we see most often at the municipal code, at the misdemeanor level. Parental status, marital status, and age don't often come into play. It's actually a fairly, I don't want to call this old because it's not as old as me, but it's a law that was codified in the mid 80s. And my suspicion is that it was probably codified around the same time as some civil codes with regard to housing and things like that. So a pretty progressive thing to have done in the mid 80s. So commits one of the following acts: assaults the victim or another person, causes physical damage to or destruction of the property of the victim or another person. There are some per se acts that we can infer people's intent, such as burning crosses on the property of a person perceived to be African American or an African American religious institution, for example. Swastikas defacing the property of a Jewish facility, or removal of religious garb or damage to a religious item, text, for example, the destruction of that, or pulling a head covering off of someone. Threatens a specific person or group of persons and places that person or members of the specific group of people in reasonable fear of harm to person or property. And the fear must be a fear that a reasonable person would have under all the circumstances. And for purposes of this section, a reasonable person is a reasonable person who is a member of the victim's race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, gender, or sexual orientation, or has the same mental, physical, or sensory handicap as the victim. That's certainly something I talk about at the academy level. Really telling officers, like, this isn't about, if you as a 6 foot tall white dude in the prime shape of his life, it's not if you're afraid, it's if, for example, you're a woman walking with children, wearing a hijab, and someone accosts you and says something threatening. Are you afraid? Are you, from that person's perspective? And, it's one of the most crucial things that I think we learn to do, and hopefully learn to do as police officers, is put ourselves in the position of the person who is telling us about what happened. Words alone do not constitute a hate crime offense unless the context or circumstances surrounding the words indicate the words are a threat. And threatening words do not constitute a hate crime offense if it's apparent to the victim that the person does not have the ability to carry out the threat. Does that all make sense?
Yes. And hopefully if people have additional questions, please drop them into the chat or the Q&A.
Well, one of the things, and you don't have to go back on the slides, Richard, is just kind of a note about the title of the law. The title of malicious harassment was certainly not a very clear title. A lot of people confused it with malicious mischief, which is the property damage law. But hate crime offense has also been a little hard to work with. There was some concern at the time that the law was retitled in 2017, that hate crime offense would cause some confusion, because if you look at the law and the text of the law, the word hate never appears again. And it has caused some difficulty with juries, for example. It is hard to convince. It's hard to convince jurors sometimes of a violation of the law because all they can think about was their hate. Did the person hate this other person? So there's a movement afoot to kind of reconsider several aspects of the law, including the title, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I can see how determining that kind of intent would be really difficult.
So, Richard, if you could go back to the types of reports that we take. When I talked about taking kind of, casting a wide net uh, for uh, for these incidents, officers are required to document in their report if there's a bias element in any case. And it doesn't have to be a hate crime. It doesn't actually even have to be a crime. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So the definition of a hate crime, a crime in which the motivation for the suspect targeting a particular person was based on their belief about the victim's membership in one or more of the legally prescribed categories. Uh, you will notice it talks about the person's belief. It is not a defense to be mistaken. We have mistaken identity cases all the time where a person thinks that they are targeting somebody from a particular group but are mistaken about that. Crime with bias elements involves the commission of any crime that is not bias based, and during the incident, the suspect uses a derogatory comment directed at the victim's protected status or group. Kind of a classic example for that is, when an offender goes in and steals from a store, on their way out, they're stopped by security and they fight security. And in the process of that, introduce like a racial slur or an anti-gay slur directed at that person. The motivation is not in that moment necessarily, it's not a hate-based crime, but it is they've brought bias into the incident, and we document those, which is, I think, important. Sometimes, we will find, we have a hate crime offender who, we have a long history of using those kinds of slurs or targeting, people with words, for example, and that can be helpful down the line. And the third category is non-criminal bias incidents. And I think this is a really important category. It is also a category that is uncommon for there to be documentation of in other jurisdictions because they are non-criminal events. But bias incidents are incidents where most often offensive derogatory comments are directed at a person's protected status. While not criminal in nature because they fall into the free speech realm, the comments may cause a level of fear and concern in the targeted community. That's, words. One of the one of the things I have certainly come to know about these non-criminal bias incidents is they really profoundly can affect a person's feeling of belonging and safety. Um, I imagine this group is, intimately knows the fear of, being targeted with anti-Semitic language, for example. It can be very, very, uh, destabilizing, fear-inducing, even if there's no explicit threat. Um, these reports are interesting in that, as I said, kind of in the previous category, they really can paint a picture of a person's conduct and really have historically, led to incidents where I've been able to identify an offender. I think of one offender in particular who was one of the first cases I worked. He had committed an anti-gay hate crime, but I didn't know what he was driving. He was unhoused and living in a vehicle. I started getting reports of a man fitting his description accosting women walking with children who he didn't think looked American. And he would stop, roll down his window, and say, "Get out of my country. You don't belong here," things like that, and then would screech away. One day, he caused enough commotion that a worker at a construction site came out and snapped a picture of his driver or of his van's license plate. And that's ultimately how I was able to find him. But it also really, kind of documented his conduct. And he went on to commit another hate crime a few years later in that same vehicle and was convicted again. I think all of these categories are important. And again, it enables us to kind of cast a really broad net to ensure that we are collecting all the data that we need to be collecting.
So for something that's a bias incident, it's recorded, but it is not like there's no repercussions for it. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
got it.
But it's, like I said, valuable information. Oftentimes it'll, help us identify somebody who's committed a crime. It doesn't happen. I say oftentimes, but it doesn't happen that often, but it can be very instructive. Sometimes it helps us to intervene with somebody who's going down a bad road. There may not be a legal consequence, but I certainly may contact that person and talk to them about their conduct.
Hmm. Got it. So can you tell us also then what the trends are looking like in Seattle as you're collecting all of this data? What are you finding?
Sure. So specifically, for our conversation, I gathered anti-Jewish reports and anti-political ideology reports, which I think are that are related to uh, the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. So anti-Jewish incidents, that's the slide that is up now for the past 3 years. We can kind of look and see um, you know, basically the kinds of reports we've been getting. The red line being hate crime, the purple line being crimes with bias elements, and the green line being non-criminal biased incidents. Um, I think we have to remember in 2020, well, I'm sure you all remember, we're talking about, the march in Charleston. We're talking about other anti-Semitic activity. So this is, um, you know, certainly something that I've been keeping an eye on since I started in this job in 2015. Just really trying to pay attention to the trends that we're seeing and talking about the trends. And again, numbers don't tell the whole story. I think, um, you know, addressing fear, addressing, the hard emotions around, current events. That's, you know, the numbers don't necessarily reflect that or can't do that. Um, so these are the trends here
So
for anti-Jewish reporting currently,
yeah,
and then
so
political. Sure.
oh wait, Richard, can you go back one slide? So just to pause on this slide, because I know we were talking about this just a few moments ago before the program started, and there's also a couple questions coming in the chat. Same thing, that I think this graph is really surprising to some, because what we're hearing so much in the news and through Anti-Defamation League and through other organizations is that anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish crimes are on the rise. And this graph is showing us something very different. So I know Seattle is just one place where this data is being collected and represented here, but can you tell us a little bit more about like why we might be seeing things going down in Seattle?
Um, I think one of the things that we need to, like, one piece of the context is, I think you probably get a lot of the same alerts that I do, where we get these kind of mass swaths of kind of like national incidents where threats are sent out online or bomb threats are sent out online, and they tend to be reported at the federal level. Like they sort of may or may not touch down in Seattle. So, for example, bomb threats at schools or Zoom bombings, or where people, someone invades a meeting space, things like that, and that may happen at multiple locations across the country. That's context I always try to keep in mind, that those things are very much in our consciousness because we're hearing about them, and it certainly has an effect here uh, on on the way people feel and how safe people feel. But it may not be something that is direct in Seattle. It may not happen at a Seattle school. It may not happen at a Seattle organization, but is definitely in our consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that kind
Uh,
of goes back to what you were saying. It's like about how we're feeling about the bigger picture that isn't really represented in the numbers.
Correct. So, I remember, I think about that every morning when I read the news. What is the effect on this group? What is the effect on this group when I'm looking at, and I read the news a lot for this exact content, to kind of put our numbers into context. Um, one of the, if you want to go to the next slide, Richard, one of the kind of confounding issues of this current situation is we may have incidents which are not explicitly anti-Jewish or may not be anti-Jewish in content, but may be directed at the Israeli government or about the war specifically. So this was a kind of a sticky, difficult, after October 7th, 2023, talking with, the U.S. Attorney's Office, talking with the King County Prosecutor's Office about how we parse this is challenging. I think, again, it's a very complex issue, and the law is not necessarily good at complexity. So a lot of, I think of the context here is so much about protests about the war feels very personal, but that we have to take the actual act itself and the words themselves, kind of on their face, right? So the anti-political ideology reports cover those incidents where we have an incident or an act that is specifically directed, at the political aspects of this, at the war. Does that make sense? Or what governments are doing. Not what, not directed at necessarily individual people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or a
Yeah.
group of people.
Mhm.
And, like I said, as I said, I can't, we have to take the incident on its face and look at the information that is provided and really be cautious about how we categorize that.
Mhm. Yeah, I imagine there's a lot of gray area between some of these different categories and what's considered anti-political ideology versus an anti-Jewish act or statement. I I would just think that the lines are very blurry in some incidences.
It can be very blurry, extremely blurry.
So just on this same topic, I see a question came in that I just think might be relevant to address as we're talking about these different categories. And the question asks, so what about graffiti at UW that reads, kill your local colonizer or kill all Zionists? Were the UW to manage, to identify the responsible parties, does this meet the criteria for hate bias incident?
So University of Washington, we did not. So University of Washington would handle that case. That is not a case that we had here reported to us. But let me put some thought to that one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I know that's a big question, and it's a big question to consider.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's, every time one of these incidents comes in, I really give it a lot of thought. I may call the prosecutor, hash it out, talk it out, and really kind of try to take it apart. So yeah, that's challenging.
Yeah. I know, and it puts you on the spot when, it puts you on the spot for sure.
Well, I will tell you, I mean, this is one of the most complex issues that has arisen since 2015.
How do you find these trends, like what we were just seeing in those last graphs? How do the trends in Seattle compare to other cities? Do you know how that?
I don't actually often compare to other cities, and the reason I don't make a lot of comparisons with other cities is not a lot of cities keep records at the same level that we keep our stats. I would say like Boston is an agency that has historically kept pretty good statistics, but across the San Francisco might, but again, they're not as accessible necessarily. We post ours online.
Hmm.
These, these belong to the community. Like these don't belong to the Seattle Police Department. This information, I gather for you. Um, and I was just actually looking at, I think it was, I can't, it was a large agency in California. I don't want to say San Francisco because it could be wrong. It could have been San Diego. It could be, but it was just much less digestible. It was in a much different format. Um, if you pull it up on the FBI's website, it can be a little difficult to parse through. And the thing to also know is if you look at the FBI statistics for Seattle, they're going to look different because their rubric for what is kind of makes it through their
Hmm.
filter is a lot tighter than ours. So it's different. There are certain things that they wouldn't, they don't take as a hate crime that will not be reflected in their numbers. So please don't expect those to be the same, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you really can't do a direct comparison because, as you were saying previously, it's just not standardized.
Correct. And I think one of the things that people also need to know about hate crime law across the country is that not all states have the same categories. Gender discrimination and hate crime, is not covered at every state. Uh, you know,
Hmm.
you know, being gay, having a, gender identity, it is not the same across this country at all.
Hmm.
The federal law is quite different than our state law. Um, so just understanding that it's a patchwork across this country, it is not all the same. I think Washington state's law, as far as category coverage, is solid, uh, and I'm happy about that. But there are always challenges and unintended consequences to changes in the law, changes to language,
Hmm.
et cetera.
So, Beth, I just want to shift gears a little bit before we turn to the many questions that are coming in from the people watching. And I'm really interested to know a little bit more about the work you're doing with the Auschwitz Institute. Can you tell us about what that looks like and how that relates to the role that you're in?
So, the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities is an educational nonprofit um, that I've been instructing for since early 2021. I teach police officers across the country, uh, you know, about uh, you know trauma-informed policing, about defensible police practices. Their repair program started really in response to 2020, the death of George Floyd, the
Mhm.
murder of George Floyd. Although I had taken a course from them in 2018 or 2019 about constitutional policing and civilian oversight. Um, my involvement with them goes back to 2018, I believe, and then instructing for them, was a really important. I felt like it was such an important thing to do, to talk across this country about how we respond, you know in the face of outcry and pushback, and really look honestly at the way we're conducting policing, ensuring that we have good oversight, good training. We understand our context as police officers in this country. I'd been a police officer for a long time before I really understood that my history isn't Pelian policing, right? That's not the history of policing in the United States. And really having to come to a hard understanding about this may represent certain things to me. I'm a second generation police officer. My father was a police officer for over 20 years, and just recognizing that this thing I'm so proud of, and that I work so hard for, and the value that I see in it is not seen the same way by communities in this country. So, really educating officers about that history, putting us in context, putting us in historic context. One of the modules in that coursework is about the role of policing in the Holocaust and the legitimacy lent to Hitler and his movement by co-opting local police departments and local police officers, and the way they were able to gather information about people, the way they were able to motivate the community against Jews, and really putting our work in that context is so crucial, especially when we're facing some really significant challenges to our democracy. We are a protector of democracy, protector of our community, and I think reinforcing that role, reinforcing that idea, broadening our scholarship as police officers and our understanding as police officers is very critical, always, but I think it's very critical now. It is
Yeah, I
very critical.
feel like we need more of you. So you're also working on a program now looking at preventing extremism in police departments. I mean, this is fascinating. Can you tell us more about that as well?
Sure. So I am currently enrolled as a doctoral student in the Antioch Graduate School for Leadership and Change. So I'm that will be my part of my work. I have a background in mental health work. I went back to school in 2006 and got a master's degree, earned a master's degree in counseling psychology. And I practiced from 2009 to 2013 at a local private treatment center, um, working on mental health. I was really uh, interested in mental health for first responders.
Mhm.
And also, I was a sexual assault and domestic violence detective at the time. So I was also working with a lot of really traumatized people, and you know, understanding how trauma manifests in people and how it affects us. I think, really, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but
Mm.
the work that I'm going to be doing is officer wellness work, and I think mentally healthy officers who have a place to go with their trauma to process it, who are connected closely with their colleagues, connected closely with their community, who feel supported by their department, who have a positive relationship to mental health. Isolation and shrunken viewpoints and narrowed perspectives and loneliness and isolation, that I think that's such a big part of preventing extremism in police officers. And it's become something that certainly has been looked at uh, in the past, gosh, decade. As we've found police officers on the rolls of oath keepers and proud boys and things like that across the country, those kinds of concerns, we have to really be talking about it explicitly. um,
Yeah.
when we're doing officer selection, when we're doing officer training, when issues come up in society, I think it's something that we've got to be really explicitly discussing.
Hmm. I think that is so important. It's like you're really looking at some of those like root causes of how these things grow, and police hold a lot of power. And it's like how do we kind of remind police officers and also create a society that can use that influence and that power for good.
Absolutely.
Okay, Beth, in the interest of time, and because there are so many questions, I'd love to turn to some of the questions that are coming in and direct them to you. And one in particular, which you were kind of alluding to, comes from Thomas, who says, what are police officers being taught to do to protect victims of hate-driven crimes, to protect the victims of the crimes once they're identified? So when a hate crime perpetrator is caught, do the police have a role in confronting the perpetrator regarding his or her
Mhm.
hate action?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll give you the example of a 911 call. If we have a 911 call come in and officers respond, if we have, officers respond and talk to the involved parties and find out what happened. If there's a crime, they should be arrested, right? If it's a hate crime offense, they should be taken to jail, which is what happens. Um, if the best thing we can do at this point is do our job as to enforce the law, to get the person in the system, into the criminal justice system, and ensure that they're responsible for their conduct. With that, officers, will often talk with victims about obtaining an order, a civil order through King County to, prevent contact with that person. But one of the things that I will say is oftentimes these are incidents that occur between strangers that are opportunistic.
Mm.
Um, so sometimes that isn't so much an issue, but just really helping to walk people through that process. And that's part of my job as well. As if, we get, if I get a case that comes across my desk, you know, contacting the victim and, talking about those safety issues, if they need a safety audit at their residence, if they want to talk about personal safety, like, how can we meet those needs? We also have victim advocates here and at the prosecutor's office who work closely with victims as well, helping them to get orders and things like that.
That's great. That's great. Um, so there's another question, and this might be difficult to answer, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. How there's there's um there's a lot of gray area around how we define anti-Semitism. And I wonder, as you're looking at these different reports and incidents, what kind of definition of anti-Semitism, or what is the definition of anti-Semitism that you're using to kind of determine where things fall?
So whenever I receive a case, like, I refer back to our RCW. So, if we're looking at a criminal act, I have to look at, what is the content? What are the words? What was said? What were the acts? So, if there is content that suggests something is anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, whether it's a symbol or a slur, or a threat, I have to look at that in the context of the law. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that does make sense. And I'll throw it out there to people who are watching, if you have follow-up questions to that, because I saw there were a couple, please type them in the chat. There's a question, a broader question here that comes from Alan, who wants to know, what was your motivation to take on this role?
Oh my gosh. Well, my motivation to take on this role, I'm a very curious person when it comes to systems, uh, kind of what makes our society run, I guess I'm not articulating this very well. But I think, 2015, 2016, we experienced something in our political space that I don't think we had encountered before. And I was a political science major in my undergrad. um, so I think, part of it certainly is just, I love helping people. I love interacting with people. One of my favorite things about this job is it has taken me all over the city, at talking with groups of people I may have never encountered. Just as a detective working any other kind of case, talking about, talking to people who may not get a lot of police attention, recent immigrants to the country, helping people understand our system, being the face of the department, the first person they talk to at SPD, and answering questions, and really being, getting the opportunity to be helpful and kind, and to direct people to resources they may not know that are available to them. For example, I found that most people who didn't speak English thought 911 was for English speakers only.
Mm.
um, so, really, in some ways, took me kind of back to the very basics of community policing, and developing those relationships before a crisis, which is fundamental in policing. It is crucially important. But also kind of in this other realm of like looking at systems, looking at, watching what happened during COVID, watching what was happening at the border, really looking at, stratify, the strata in our country, the stratification, economically, and, how different groups of people are treated, and, what motivates hate. I think I get asked a lot about hate motivation. And the more I do this job, the more I realize that a lot of the motivation behind hate is this kind of created scarcity in our country. If you want to make people hateful toward another group, talk about what they have that you don't, even whether it's true or it's not true, or
Mhm.
something they've done, um, to you, whether or not they have anything to do with it. For example, anti-Asian COVID crime, or, they're eating the pets, right?
Yeah.
How that, those bigger national issues land in communities, and talking about that to student officers, for example, and just making, trying to broaden their perspective, that, so that they can recognize hate when they see it. Like it may look like something else. It may not look like what you expect. So, it's all of both ends of kind of the very simple kind of community policing aspects to
Mhm.
looking at the bigger issues in our country. So it's definitely a role that has always had something new to explore.
Yeah, I mean, you have such a big job and it's so important. I think I speak for all of us when I say how grateful we are that you are in this role and are doing such an amazing job, not only to educate our community, but to educate the police officers and to bring these topics to light and to bring them to our attention, to help keep our community safe. This is an enormous responsibility that you have. And thank you so much for being willing to take it on.
Oh, that's so kind of you to say. It's been immensely rewarding to me.
What,
Um,
so I have one last question for you, and that would be, what do you think, all of us lay people out here, what should we know? Like, what's one thing that, you
oh my
would like us to take away from this?
That may be the hardest question that you've asked me. I think that is the hardest question that you've asked me yet. What would I, you know, boy, that is a tough question.
You can think about it. You can
Can I
let it
think
go
about it?
later.
The one thing, that one thing. Oh boy.
Pressure's on, Beth.
That is,
I love
yeah.
that
I
this
mean,
is the hardest question.
you probably didn't expect that to be the hardest question.
That's all right. I mean, you've given us so much great information here, and I think you've also like shown us how these statistics are really complicated. Like nothing is just a straight answer. Like we look at these graphs and it's like there's still a lot of layers and
Mhm.
complexity to it, and it shouldn't just be taken at face value. I think that's really important because when I think of how what we keep hearing is anti-Semitism is on the rise, and that is true, but the graphs show something different. So how to reconcile all this different information is an interesting thing, I think, to leave with.
I think, the thing I would really want to leave everybody with is, I think, the thought that I had after I visited the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh a couple of years
Mm.
ago. Um, and it's about, and I don't need to lecture this group uh, about, you know, kindness, or uh, considering other people, or, not listening to voices that are trying to, make you think ill of someone else. I think, I was really impacted when I went there. Um, and it just, again, I feel like I'm not articulating this well, but it was just such a, um, for people who have not been to Tree of Life Synagogue, it's in the middle of this incredible neighborhood, like so many of the neighborhoods we have here. And it just, there are houses across the street and a children's clinic across the other street. And it's beautiful and tree lined. And there's this, you know, synagogue there that feels like a bomb crater, you know, and hate did that. Hate did that, you know, and I just, um, you know, with everything that I do in this job, I want to combat that. And I want to bring people together and, you know, help heal the world. You know, so that's maybe not necessarily one thing I have for you, but maybe something that just always is guiding me. So
I
thank you
think
for
that's
having
amazing. Yeah, I think that is amazing, and I see lots of people writing in here in the comments. One person says, "Thank you so much for your perspective, your commitment, and your wisdom, and thanks for all of the great questions." So, uh, Beth, truly, and another one here from Hillary Bernstein, who I know you
Oh,
know. Just thanking you for
yes.
your incredible commitment and your passion for this work, which really comes through so clearly.
Oh my gosh. Well, likewise, Hillary Bernstein.
We are we are so lucky to have you here in Seattle. Thank you so, so much, Beth, for all that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me today. I can't thank you enough.
We're really grateful. And thank you to everybody who wrote in with so many great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Beth, maybe we'll have to have you back so we can address more of them. I think this leaves me with more
I'd love to.
questions than answers, and I hope we can continue the conversation. For those of you watching, I hope you can also join us for our next Lunch and Learn program, which is on November 12th. Where we will ask some hard questions about the role of Americans and American society and how they were involved in the Holocaust. So this includes looking at how the government, the media, faith leaders, refugee organizations, celebrities, and others responded to what they were seeing going on in Nazi Germany. All of this work that we do at the Holocaust Center would not be possible without our outstanding team. I want to give a special thanks to Richard Green, who is keeping track of the slides and the images and running this program behind the scenes. And thank you to our entire team, our interim CEO, Lynn Smith, Jessica Michaels, Paul Regelbrug, Brand Anderson, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Lexi Jason, Amanda Davis, Lisa Spink, Katie Lawrence, Michael Langberg, Liz Hall, Arlene Lugtu, Mario Felipe Bamonte, and Rosa Campos. Thank you also to the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany for their support of this program. And thank you to all of you for watching today. I look forward to seeing you at our next program in November. This concludes the program for today.